The phone call came in at exactly 11:47 p.m.
On September 28th, Jennifer Gledhill called police to report her husband, Matthew Johnson, missing.
The disappearance of Matthew Johnson, a Utah father and husband, and the arrest of his wealthy wife, Jennifer Gledhill, for first-degree murder.
On the surface, it sounded routine, calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. A wife reporting her husband missing. But what Jennifer Gledhill said during that call would later become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. Because by the time she picked up that phone, her husband was already dead. And she knew exactly where his body was. Or more precisely, where no one would ever find it.
Jen in our home before and, breaking bread with them, and then it turned out that she's responsible for his death. It was shocking.
On September 28th, Jennifer Gledhill contacted police to report that her husband, Matthew Johnson, had disappeared. She told them he had left voluntarily, said he needed space, said he might be gone for a week, and most importantly, she told them not to worry. But something about the call didn't sit right. Not with investigators. Not with the people who knew Matthew. Because Matthew Johnson wasn't the kind of man who just vanished. He was a father of 3. A soldier. A man with structure, discipline, and responsibility wired into his identity. You don't just walk away from that. Not without saying goodbye. Matthew Johnson was 51 years old. A decorated member of the Utah National Guard's 19th Special Forces Group. A Green Beret. The kind of man who had spent years training for chaos, but lived his personal life with order. Friends described him as sharp, analytical, dependable. If there was a problem, Matthew was the one people called. If there was confusion, he brought clarity. He had that rare combination of intelligence and calm under pressure. But what made him most respected wasn't just his military service. It was who he was at home. A father. A steady presence. Someone his kids could rely on. Jennifer Gledhill, on the other hand, seemed like the perfect complement. She was 42. Soft-spoken. Reserved. To outsiders, she came across as kind, even quiet. The type of person who kept to herself. A devoted mother. A supportive military wife. Nothing about her stood out in a negative way. Nothing that would make you look twice. And maybe that's what made everything that came next so difficult to understand. Together, they lived in an upscale home in Cottonwood Heights, Utah. A beautiful neighborhood. The kind where everything looks peaceful. Manicured lawns. Quiet streets. Families building stable lives. Inside that home were 3 children, ages 11, 7, and 5. From the outside, it looked like a life most people would envy. A strong marriage. A successful husband. A stable home. The kind of life that feels secure. Predictable. Safe. But the truth is, the most dangerous cracks are the ones no one else can see. Months before Matthew ever went missing, the foundation of that perfect life had already begun to fracture. And not in a subtle way. This wasn't a slow drift apart. It was tension building under pressure. Silence turning into resentment. Resentment turning into something far more volatile. By July of 2024, the marriage was already hanging by a thread. Divorce wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was being seriously discussed. Considered. Almost inevitable. But what was happening behind closed doors was far more intense than a typical failing marriage. Court documents would later reveal a relationship filled with emotional conflict. Arguments that escalated. Communication that broke down into hostility. Moments where both sides pushed each other to the edge. Then in August, Jennifer made a move that would shift everything. She filed for a protective order against Matthew. She claimed she was afraid of him. Afraid for her safety. On paper, it painted a very clear narrative. A wife seeking protection from a potentially dangerous husband. But when the case reached court, that narrative began to unravel. The judge reviewed the evidence. Videos. Messages. Interactions between the two. And what he saw didn't match Jennifer's claims. There was no clear victim. No one-sided fear. Instead, what emerged was something far more complicated, a relationship where both individuals were confrontational, where conflict wasn't avoided. It was engaged. Repeatedly. Text messages showed Jennifer speaking to Matthew in a way that raised serious concerns. Berating him. Belittling him. Pushing him emotionally. At times, it appeared she was trying to provoke a reaction. Trying to draw something out of him. Something that could justify her claims. But it didn't work. The court wasn't convinced. The protective order was dismissed. And in his final ruling, the judge wrote something that would later feel almost haunting. He described the marriage as highly dysfunctional, said it brought out the worst in both parties, and suggested that divorce should have happened long before things reached this point. At the time, it sounded like a standard legal conclusion. Just another failed marriage. Just another couple that couldn't make it work. But what the court didn't know, what no one knew, was that Jennifer had already moved past divorce. In her mind, there was another solution. And it didn't involve lawyers, or custody battles, or separation agreements. It involved something permanent. In the weeks following that court decision, something changed in Matthew. People around him noticed it. Subtle at first, then undeniable. He seemed distracted, less relaxed, like he was carrying something heavy in his mind, something unresolved. Friends would later say he appeared uneasy, on edge, as if he no longer felt safe in his own home. At one point, that feeling became so strong, he stopped sleeping there altogether. Instead, he stayed at a National Guard facility, choosing a military environment over his own bedroom. That alone says everything. A trained soldier, more comfortable in a guarded facility than in his own house. And then came one of his final conversations. A moment that, in hindsight, feels like a warning no one fully understood. He spoke to a close friend, opened up in a way he hadn't before, and admitted something with quiet certainty. The marriage was over. It was time to move on. There was no anger in it, no dramatic emotion, just acceptance, clarity. He had made a decision, a clean break, a chance to start over. But there was one problem. Jennifer wasn't ready to let go. Because while Matthew was preparing to leave, Jennifer was already somewhere else. Emotionally, mentally, and physically. She was having an affair. And not the kind that fades quietly. Not something casual or temporary. This was different. It was intense. All-consuming. The kind of connection that rewires how someone thinks. How they feel. How they justify things they normally wouldn't. And this relationship would become the key to everything. Because the man she was involved with would later become the one person who could expose the truth. But at this point in the story, he had no idea what he was about to get pulled into. To him, Jennifer was just a woman in a complicated marriage. Someone looking for connection, understanding, escape. He didn't see her as dangerous. He didn't see what was coming. But there was one moment that, in hindsight, changes everything. September 19, 2024. Just 2 days before Matthew would be killed, Jennifer showed him something. Something small, but deeply significant. A gun. A Glock 19X. Loaded. Kept inside her home. At the time, it didn't raise alarms. Many households, especially military families, owned firearms. It wasn't unusual. But the way she showed it, the timing, the context, that's what makes it different. Because now, looking back, it doesn't feel casual. It feels intentional. Almost like she was testing something. Or preparing him. Without saying it out loud. Because by that point, the decision had already been made. This wasn't about saving a marriage anymore. It was about ending it. Completely. And quietly. Behind the scenes, Jennifer had already started putting things in place. Small details. Calculated steps. The kind that don't draw attention individually, but together. Form a plan. One of those steps involved her children. She arranged for all 3 of them to stay with her parents. On a specific night. Not randomly. Not casually. Deliberately. Because she knew they couldn't be there for what was about to happen. That decision alone reveals something critical. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a sudden emotional break. This was preparation. Planning. Control. And everything was leading to one moment. September 20th, 2024. The night everything would finally collapse. At some point that evening, the truth came out. Matthew found out about the affair. We don't know exactly how. A message. A suspicion confirmed. A confrontation. But we know what happened next. The argument. Not just any argument, but the kind that had been building for months. Loud. Heated. Explosive. Years of frustration. Condensed into a single moment. Betrayal. Anger. Resentment. Everything surfaced at once. And in that moment, there was no turning back. No fixing it. No calming it down. Just two people. Standing at the edge of something irreversible. And somewhere inside that chaos, a line was crossed. One that would lead to murder. From secret affair to murder. That argument didn't end with resolution. It didn't end with silence. It didn't even end with distance. It ended with something far more dangerous. A decision that had already been made, now colliding with reality. We don't know the exact final words exchanged between Matthew and Jennifer that night. But we know the emotional landscape. Betrayal had been exposed. Trust had been shattered. And whatever illusion remained was gone. At some point, the house went quiet. The kind of quiet that follows chaos. Heavy. Uneasy. Unresolved. And then, Matthew went to sleep. That's the part that stays with people. He went to bed. In his own home. Believing that, whatever happened next, would be handled in the morning. But there would be no morning for him. In the early hours of September 21st, 2024, while the house sat in complete darkness, Jennifer Gledhill made her move. There was no struggle. No warning. No second chance. She walked into the bedroom, where her husband lay asleep. Completely vulnerable. Completely unaware. And in that moment, everything came down to a single action. She picked up his 9mm handgun. A weapon he trusted enough to keep in his own home. A weapon that symbolized protection. Control. Safety. And she turned it on him. One shot. That's all it took. A single gunshot, echoing through a house that, just hours earlier, held a family. And just like that, Matthew Johnson was gone. No final words. No goodbye. No chance to fight back. Just silence. But what happened next is what truly separates this case from others. Because for most people, that moment would break them. Shock would take over. Panic. Fear. Regret. But not Jennifer. What followed wasn't chaos. It wasn't emotional collapse. It was methodical. Calculated. Controlled. According to her later confession, she didn't call for help. She didn't hesitate. She moved. She retrieved a rooftop storage container. The kind people use for travel. Storage. Everyday, harmless purposes. And then she did something almost unimaginable. She placed her husband's body inside it. Think about that for a second. The physical effort. The mental state required. This wasn't just a crime of passion anymore. This was execution. Followed by process. She dragged the container through the house. Step by step. Down the stairs. Each movement deliberate. Each decision already mapped out. There's something deeply unsettling about that image, because it tells you something critical. She wasn't reacting. She was following a plan. Eventually, she got the container outside. Loaded it into the back of their minivan. The same vehicle used for family trips. School runs. Daily life. Now turned into something else entirely. Then came the next step. She smashed his phone. Not just to destroy it, but to erase him. His calls. His messages. His digital presence. It wasn't just about hiding evidence. It was about removing him from existence. Then she took his truck. drove it away from the house, left it in a nearby neighborhood. Abandoned. A staged disappearance. A false trail. Something to make it look like Matthew had left on his own. But the most disturbing part was still ahead. Because Jennifer wasn't done. She got back into the minivan and began driving north. No one knows exactly what was going through her mind during that drive. Was she thinking about what she had done? Was she focused only on what came next? Or had she already convinced herself that this was necessary? At some point along that route, she stopped. And somewhere in northern Utah, she buried her husband. A shallow grave. An unmarked location. A place no one has been able to find since. To this day, Matthew Johnson's body has never been recovered. Which means one thing. Jennifer is the only person who knows where he is. And she's never told anyone. After the burial, she drove home. And that's when the second phase began. The cleanup. If the first part of this crime was about removing Matthew, this part was about removing the evidence. She entered the house, the same house where hours earlier, a man had been alive. And she started erasing what happened. Bleach. It's always bleach. The smell. The harshness. The unmistakable sign of something being hidden. She cleaned the walls. The floors. The bedroom. Anywhere blood might have touched. Anywhere evidence might remain. But blood doesn't disappear easily. It seeps. It stains. It lingers in places you don't expect. And that's what makes this part so telling. Because she didn't just clean. She replaced. She ordered a brand new mattress. Think about the mindset behind that. Not just removing evidence, but rebuilding the scene. Creating a version of reality where nothing had ever happened. The new mattress arrived just 2 days later. Placed exactly where the old one had been. As if Matthew had never been there at all. But despite all of this, despite the planning, the execution, the cleanup, Jennifer made one mistake. One decision that would unravel everything. She told someone. September 22nd. Just before midnight. Jennifer showed up at her lover's house. And what she did next would change everything. She confessed. Not partially. Not vaguely. Completely. She told him everything. How she killed Matthew. How she moved his body. How she cleaned the house. Even the smallest details. At some point during that conversation, he noticed something. Bruises. Marks on her body. And when he asked about them, her response was disturbingly casual. She told him they came from dragging the body. From burying her husband. From cleaning the scene. No hesitation. No emotion. Just facts. That moment alone tells you everything about her state of mind. Because most people, even after committing a crime, still feel something. Fear. Guilt. Shock. But Jennifer? She spoke about it like she was describing a task she had completed. And in that moment, her lover realized something terrifying. He didn't know this woman. Not really. The person sitting in front of him was capable of something far beyond what he had imagined. And he knew he needed protection. So he made a decision. He would record her. The next time they spoke. Because if what she was saying was true, he was now connected to a murder. And he needed proof. That next conversation would become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. During the call, he told her something simple. That he was scared. Scared of her. And her response was immediate. Calm. Almost confused. If you think I could even hurt a fly. And then she said something that would haunt investigators. He wasn't a person anymore. He wasn't Matt. That sentence changes everything. Because it reveals something deeper than just a crime. It reveals justification. In her mind, Matthew was no longer human. And once you remove someone's humanity, what happens next becomes easier to accept. Easier to do. That's how people cross lines they never thought they could. They rewrite reality. And Jennifer had already done that. But she didn't stop there. The conversation continued. And it only got worse. At one point, her lover asked her a hypothetical question. If the roles were reversed, would she be afraid? Her answer? Not if I deserved it. Think about that. Not fear. Not shock. Acceptance. As if violence was justified under the right conditions. As if death could be earned. And then came something even more disturbing. She began describing her worldview. Talking about people she considered bad. People she believed didn't deserve to exist. She spoke about them like they were disposable. Like removing them would improve the world. It wasn't just about Matthew anymore. This was a mindset. A belief system. One that allowed her to rationalize what she had done. And yet, in the same conversation, she asked him not to see her as a monster. That contradiction is what makes this case so unsettling. Because on one hand, she justified murder. On the other, she still wanted to be understood, accepted, seen as the same person she had always been. But that person was gone. If they ever truly existed at all. And there was one more detail from that call that investigators couldn't ignore. She referred to Matthew in the past tense, as if he had already been gone for days. Which, of course, he had. But officially, he wasn't even missing yet. That wouldn't happen until later. And that detail, that slip, would become one of the earliest cracks in her story. Because the timeline didn't match. And once investigators started pulling at that thread, everything began to unravel. Everything looked normal. Or at least, normal enough. Jennifer moved through life as if nothing had happened. She stayed in the same house. Slept in the same bed. Walked through the same rooms where her husband had taken his last breath. There's something deeply unsettling about that kind of composure. Because it tells you this wasn't just about panic. It wasn't a breakdown. It was control. 6 days passed. 6 days between the murder and the moment Jennifer finally called the police. That gap matters. Because in those 6 days she had time. Time to clean. Time to think. Time to build a story. And when she finally made that call, she was ready. She told investigators that Matthew had left voluntarily. Said he needed space. Said he told her not to contact him for a week. On the surface, it sounded plausible. Marriages fall apart. People leave. Space gets taken. But something didn't add up. Because while Jennifer was telling police not to worry, other people already were. Matthew hadn't shown up for duty. And that alone was a red flag. A man like Matthew Johnson doesn't miss obligations. Doesn't disappear without explanation. So while Jennifer was trying to control the narrative, the reality was already slipping out of her hands. And then came the moment that would change everything. October 2nd, 2024. The man Jennifer had trusted with her secret went to the police. He didn't just walk in with a story. He brought evidence. Text messages. Recorded phone calls. Her voice. Her words. Her confession. Everything. And in that moment, the case shifted. This was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was a homicide. And police moved quickly. They obtained a search warrant. Returned to the house. But this time, they weren't looking for signs of absence. They were looking for signs of violence. And they found them. Inside the master bedroom, there was a stain in the carpet. Dark. Spread out. Hidden beneath where the bed had been. Blood. Not a small amount. Not something accidental. Something significant. Something that told a very different story than the one Jennifer had told. Investigators looked closer. The bed frame. There were stains there too. On the slats. In places that aligned perfectly with what the lover had described in his statement. And then, the smell. Bleach. Strong enough to linger. Strong enough to signal one thing: something had been cleaned. Recently. But no matter how much you clean, you can't erase everything. There were reddish-brown spots on the walls. On the blinds. On surfaces that had been missed. Tiny details. But in cases like this, tiny details matter. And then there was the mattress. Brand new. That alone raised questions. Why replace a mattress so suddenly? Why now? Phone records answered that. Jennifer had ordered it just days after Matthew's death. Delivered within 48 hours. Right into the same room where investigators were now standing. It wasn't just suspicious. It was confirmation. But perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence came from her phone. GPS data? Digital footprints. The kind you can't easily erase. Investigators tracked her movements on September 21st and 22nd. And what they found matched her confession almost perfectly. She had traveled to the area where Matthew's truck was found. Early in the morning. Then later. She drove north. Far enough to align with her own statement about where she had buried the body. The data didn't lie. It never does. And now, everything was lining up. The confession. The physical evidence. The digital trail. It all pointed to one person. Jennifer Gledhill. That same day, October 2nd, 2024, police made the arrest. She was charged with first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. But even then, the case wasn't over. Because investigators quickly realized Jennifer may not have acted alone after the fact. There were gaps. Moments where she couldn't have done everything by herself. And those gaps led them to another shocking discovery. Her parents. Weeks later, on October 24th, Jennifer's mother and father were arrested. Both charged with multiple counts of obstruction of justice. At first, it seemed unbelievable. Parents helping cover up the murder of their son-in-law. But the evidence told a different story. Investigators discovered that the couple had spent over 5 hours at Jennifer's house shortly after the murder. But when questioned, they claimed they had only been there briefly. Less than an hour. That discrepancy mattered. Because time equals opportunity. And 5 hours is more than enough time to help clean, to move things, to remove evidence. Then came another detail. Jennifer's mother had purchased the new mattress. The same one that replaced the blood-soaked original. And then, her phone was remotely reset. All data wiped. All records of her movements during that time, gone. Or at least, that was the intention. But in cases like this, attempts to hide the truth often reveal more than the truth itself. And then came a statement that investigators couldn't ignore. During questioning, Jennifer's father said something unusual. "I did not go in where the incident happened." The incident. That word choice mattered. Because at that point, no one had officially told him there had been an incident. And yet, he spoke as if he already knew. As if he understood exactly what had taken place. It was a subtle slip, but a powerful one, because it suggested knowledge. And knowledge means involvement. Then investigators searched the parents' home. What they found added another layer to the case. Inside a storage container, wrapped in a child's clothing, was a gun box. A Glock 19X. The same type of weapon Jennifer had shown her lover just days before the murder. The same type believed to have been used to kill Matthew. It was no longer just suspicion. It was a pattern. A coordinated effort to hide the truth. But even with all of this evidence, one question still remained. Where is Matthew Johnson? Despite extensive search efforts across multiple counties, his body has never been found. Search teams have combed through areas stretching from Davis County to Weber County, all the way toward the Utah-Idaho border. Over 70 people have participated. Law enforcement, volunteers, even Matthew's fellow soldiers. Men who trained with him, served with him, trusted him. All searching for one thing, closure. But months later, they're still searching, still hoping, still waiting. Because without a body, there's no final goodbye. No place to grieve. Just questions and silence. At one point during the investigation, a breakthrough seemed possible. A vehicle storage container, similar to the one Jennifer described, was found floating in water. Inside it, traces of Matthew's blood. It was confirmation, but not closure, because his body still wasn't there. And that absence has become one of the most haunting aspects of this case. Jennifer Gledhill has pleaded not guilty to all charges. She now faces multiple counts, including first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, abuse of a human body, and witness tampering. During her bail hearing, prosecutors made something very clear. They believed she was dangerous, not just because of what she had done, but because of what she might still do. They revealed that she had told her lover something chilling, that she would rather shoot herself than go to jail. That statement mattered, because it showed desperation and unpredictability. The judge agreed. Bail was denied. Jennifer remains in custody, awaiting trial. A trial that is scheduled to begin in December 2025, and expected to last just over a week. But for the people closest to this case, time doesn't move the same way. Because while the legal process continues, real lives remain frozen in place. Especially for 3 people, 3 children, who lost their father to violence, and their mother to the consequences of it. In a statement released by Matthew's family, they expressed something simple. Hope. Hope that one day they will find him. Hope that someone, anyone, will come forward and tell them where he is, so they can finally lay him to rest. Because until that happens, this story doesn't feel finished. And maybe it never truly will. Prosecutors believe the motive is clear. Jennifer didn't want a divorce. Not the kind that comes with consequences. Shared custody, financial obligations, a complicated future. Instead, she chose control, a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And now, as the trial approaches, one question continues to echo through every part of this case. How does someone go from being a mother, a partner, a seemingly ordinary person, to someone capable of this? Was it the affair? Was it the resentment? Or was it something deeper? Something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment? And the Word of God says in Jeremiah 17 verse 9, "The heart is deceitful above all things, and it is extremely sick. Who can understand it fully and know its secret motives?" We may never fully understand, but what we do know is what was lost. A father, a life, a future that will never happen. And somewhere out there, in a place no one has been able to find, Matthew Johnson is still waiting. Waiting to be brought home. Waiting for the truth to be fully uncovered. And until that happens, this story remains unfinished. Not just a crime, but a mystery. I'm sure you would love more intriguing true crime stories. Follow and turn the notification bell for more.